Hi everyone, it's Ian here. Sorry for such a long gap between my last video and this one. I don't intend for that to be the case going forward. Today's topic is just very heavy, it's very sensitive subject matter, and so I just wanted to make sure I got all the facts and the delivery for everything right. But so anyway, let's just dive right into it. Racism, what's up with that? Basically, the deal with racism is that it ended on the night of November 4th, 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. So thanks for watching, everyone. Have a great night. I'm just kidding. Racism is very much alive and real. Evidence of it exists all around us every single day. Police violence and incarceration rates, those are probably some of the more go-to examples for a lot of people right now because of the deaths of Black Americans like Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain and Cornelius Fredericks, as well as George Floyd, probably most obviously, at the hands of police officers and security guards, as well as the police response to the Black Lives Matters protests that have been happening across the country, and the federal response to these protests this summer. But the thing is, police violence and incarceration rates, those are very prominent in the news right now for understandable reasons. But the problems that we face as a society are so much broader than those two things alone. And so I want to make a video that focuses on other less discussed issues. But I will make a video later on about police violence and police reform, so don't worry, I'm not just ignoring these issues, I'm just ignoring them for now. But like I said, racism is very much alive and well, and it really permeates every aspect of our lives. You can find it in fiscally related issues like unemployment rates and wages and poverty rates. If you look at the poverty rates from 2018, for example, you can see that the white poverty rate is just under 9%, meaning that 8.9% of white Americans were living in poverty in 2018, and you can compare that to the black poverty rate, which was 28.5%, meaning that over 1 in 4 black Americans was living in poverty in 2018. Which was comparable to the Hispanic poverty rate, which was 23.7, so just under 1 in 4. And to be clear, 9% of a population living in poverty is by no means admirable, but there's a very, very clear, very stark disparity between the poverty rates of whites and non-white Americans. You can also find evidence of racism and discrimination in unemployment. Black Americans have routinely had an unemployment rate that's been roughly twice that of white Americans. In January 2020, for example, just before the shutdown and the pandemic and everything has been happening. There's a pandemic, in case you're not aware. But yeah, in January 2020, the white unemployment rate was just over 3%. I think it was 3.1%. And the black unemployment rate was about 6.5%. So double. And back in January 2011, when the economy was still recovering from the 2008 recession, the white unemployment rate was about 10%, and the black unemployment rate was 20%, meaning that 1 in 5 black Americans did not have a job in 2011. Again, 10% unemployment is not admirable, but there's a very, very stark disparity between white and non-white, particularly white and black. And you can also find it. You can see if you look at wages. In 2019, the average black Americans' wages were on average 26% lower than a white person's wages, meaning that they made 26% less money each year for doing the same job. And that's actually for all black people. The rate is actually it's a larger gap when comparing black women and Hispanic women to white men. But I will be making a video later on talking about sexism and misogyny. So similar to the police violence and incarceration rates, I'm just gonna ignore that for right now. But so these disparities in unemployment rates and poverty rates, they have a very, very measurable impact on black homes in terms of income and in household wealth. And the difference between income and household wealth is similar to the difference between having money in your wallet and having money in a savings account in the bank. Apparently, the bank is back there. Um, but income is the money that you're making every year. It's your salary, and it's the money that you use to buy clothes and buy food, day-to-day stuff. And household wealth is what is used to buy major purchases, like buying a new car or a new house, investing in things, like the stock market, which I guess you can do that. I don't know how. And it's also used as a kind of a buffer to fall back on, in case trying times befall the family. A parent gets laid off, or there's, a worldwide shutdown because of, a virus. But so the average black family has about 60% of the average white family's income. So they're making about 60% of their money, and they have about 10% of the average white family's household wealth. So they're taking in about half the amount of money, and they have 10% of the money in their bank account. And so they're taking in less money and have less money to fall back on. So it allows for far less wiggle room for black Americans as compared to white Americans. Another very prominent area, though, where we can see evidence of racism and discrimination is in voting access, particularly in what are called voter ID laws. Some context behind that, though, is that in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and there was a provision in it that said that states which had a history of voter suppression, which I'll get to in a little bit, but states that had this history of voter suppression, they had to get clearing from the Federal Department of Justice before they could enact any new laws that pertain to voting access. But there was a Supreme Court case in 2013 that did away with this provision. It was Shelby County v. Holder, which essentially declawed the Voting Rights Act. And since 2013, since that ruling, there have been a wave of very strict voter ID laws passed in numerous Republican-led states, particularly the states that had this already, this pre-existing history of voter suppression. But the premise behind these voter ID laws is not necessarily that objectionable on paper and when taken at face value. They say that, if you want to vote, then you should have a valid government ID, and that the name on your ID should match the name that's on their voter registration sheet. And so, if your name is Emily Smith, for example, you're not going to think twice about that. That's fine. But, if you're Hispanic and you have multiple middle names that are hyphenated, or if you're a black American and you have apostrophes in your name, this becomes more of a problem because, even if you have a single missing hyphen or a single misplaced apostrophe is just one letter away from where it's supposed to be, or, if your name is Tredante and you spell it, and they spell it with an O instead of an A, or vice versa, you don't get to vote because you don't have an ID. And you might be trying to commit voter fraud. And these voter ID laws, they've been coupled with the closing of polling places across the city. They'll have a city that used to have, 100, 150 different polling places, and now suddenly there's only 6, which results in these multiple hour waits to be able to vote. You have to wait, 5, 6, 7 hours in line just standing there to be able to vote. And sometimes you'll wait that whole, 5, 6, 7 hours just to get to the front of the line and find out that your polling place has actually been switched without notice to one of the other 5 that exists, and it's across town. Or you'll find out that your name has simply been purged from the voter registration list, and since there's not same-day registration, there's just nothing you can do about it. But so if you have studied the history of voter suppression in the United States, because there is a very real history of voter suppression in the United States, if you've studied it, you can see that these are very clearly intended to disenfranchise minority voters. However, even if that somehow weren't the intent, it actually doesn't matter as long as the impact is discriminatory. In the eyes of the law, there are 2 different types of of discrimination. There is de facto discrimination and de jure discrimination. De facto discrimination is when the result of a law or a policy happens to be discriminatory, and de jure discrimination is when it's expressly written into the law that black people aren't allowed to do XYZ. And because of the long and very painful history of of racial discrimination in the United States, neither kind is allowed. However, there's a higher burden of proof when it comes to getting rid of de facto discrimination, because you have to prove that it's a discriminatory law, even though it doesn't expressly say that in the law. It's easier to get rid of something if it just says outright that no, we just don't want black people to vote. That would be struck down on day one. But that's why they take that different approach. But so with these statistics and these examples in mind, there are probably two different reactions right now. There's like a dog barking outside. Some of you might be asking, how all of this came to be the case, how we got to the point where we are today. And some of you might be saying that, well, okay, it's just a coincidence that black people face all these additional problems and these additional hurdles in society. But so my hope is to be able to respond to both of these concerns, or at least begin to respond to both of these concerns with some historical context. I think one thing that we can all agree on is that racism did not begin in the 21st century. Even if you think that racism is, it's not a thing anymore, it was a thing of the past, you are admitting that it was a thing in the past, that it existed historically. But so let's start by taking a look at the 20th century, the 1900s, where I think you'll find more than a handful of examples of racism and discrimination. One of the more prominent examples is in the Jim Crow legislation, the Jim Crow South. By the year 1900, which was actually only 35 years after the Civil War ended. The Civil War was not that long ago. But by the beginning of the 20th century, every single southern state had enacted legal de jure discrimination and segregation of nearly every single aspect of public life. This included church and housing and education, employment and hospitals and restaurants and bars, and even things as basic as washrooms and water fountains. It was literally every aspect of public life. But it didn't just stop at life. It extended to aspects of death. I mean, they had segregated funeral homes and morgues and cemeteries. They would literally say to you, like, oh no, you can't bury your relative here because you're black. Sorry, go try the shittier one down the street. And to be clear, they were never that polite about it. I don't think there was a single apology ever issued during any of this. It was more just like, get out. We don't take kindly to your type here. And like I said, that these were not just laws that happened to result in the exclusion of black people. This was very much de jure discrimination. It was the specific purpose of these laws not to allow black people to use this water fountain. And these also weren't. These were not like outdated laws that went unenforced, but remained on the books. I think there's a law I think it's Kentucky, it might be Tennessee, but there's a law on the books that says that it's illegal to walk around downtown with ice cream in your back pocket. That's just a very outdated law. I don't know why it was even passed in the first place. I don't know what like the need for that law was, but it's a law that exists on the books, and was just never repealed. But it goes entirely unenforced because it's so obsolete. But these discriminatory laws, this de jure discrimination was not that kind of law. These were very much enforced, and oftentimes very violently. Another area, though, where we can see examples of discrimination during the 20th century is in housing. There was a phenomenon in the post-war era, the 1940s and the 50s. It was called the white flight. This was when white people across the country, they abandoned big cities in droves and moved to the suburbs, the newly formed and still forming suburbs. But the thing is, they weren't just trying to, escape the hustle and the bustle of the city. They were very explicitly moving away from undesirable neighbors, aka black people, because in the 1930s there had been a great migration of black people from the South into northern cities like Detroit and New York City and Boston. And so after the war ended and the economy got better, all the white people were like, no thanks. And so they just left. And in fact, a lot of the deeds to these houses, these new houses that they were buying, a lot of the deeds included language that expressly barred black people from owning those homes. It literally said in the deed to the house, black people cannot own this property. And even further than that, they entire neighborhoods would enter into what were called restrictive covenants, which were neighborhood-wide agreements where they all signed a contract saying that they are not going to sell these houses to black people, and they're not going to rent them to black people. But so since all the white people left downtown, this left all the economically vulnerable black Americans. Because remember, as recently as the 2010s, modern day, black Americans only had 10% of the household wealth as the average white American family. But so in the 1940s and 50s, these economically vulnerable black Americans were left to fend for themselves in the city. And since they had far less money and they had lower income, they weren't able to they didn't pay as high taxes, and then so their property values went down, and the quality of education went down because the school funding went down, and then so their children would go to these low quality schools, and since they didn't get a very good education at the school, when they graduated and grew up, they weren't able to get a very high paying job that had good benefits or anything like that, and so they had to live their lives in poverty. And then when they had kids, they would have to send their kids to these underperforming schools because they didn't have enough money to move away. And then so those kids would grow up and graduate from these underperforming schools and enter into low paying jobs, and black American families would be trapped in this cycle of poverty. It is a cycle that repeats. And even the ones that potentially could have afforded to move out, they faced numerous obstacles, and even more so than just the deeds and the restrictive covenants that I mentioned a minute ago. One very prominent example is something called redlining. The context behind this is that during the Great Depression, there was a program created. It was called the Federal Housing Administration. And it was created as part of a New Deal program in order to keep people's homes from being foreclosed on, which is bad for the economy because people lose their houses and then they have to go live on the street because there wasn't really much of a social safety net at the time. The Great Depression is when the social safety net came to be. But so they would have to go live on the street and just kind of beg for money until they died and then rotted in the street, and then till the government could come pick up their corpse, a week or two later, if at all, because budgets were very strained at the time. It's a very bleak time for America. It is called the Great Depression after all. So it does a pretty good job of explaining how things were at the time. But the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, they created a risk rating system to determine which neighborhoods would be, safe to give these federally insured mortgages to. And they would have, a map of all the neighborhoods up on the wall. And they would take, a green pen and outline the neighborhoods that were safe to give money to. But black neighborhoods did not benefit. And they would, the people running this program, they would literally outline black neighborhoods, or even neighborhoods with a single black resident in them. They would literally take a red pen and outline that neighborhood. They would red line the neighborhood and say that none of the houses in this neighborhood are safe to give these federally insured mortgages to. They can just fend for themselves. Good luck. And again, I don't think they were that polite about it. And so it was kind of a mix between like de facto and de jure discrimination, because it was I don't believe that it was written into the language of the program that black people wouldn't be allowed to benefit, but it was everyone running the program very purposefully excluded black people from these benefits. So either way, it's bad. But further, if a black person did move to a white neighborhood, if they somehow were able to jump through all these hoops and move into a white neighborhood, realtors would literally go door to door to all the white residents of the neighborhood and scare them into selling the houses. I mean, they'd say like, "Hey, look, like there goes the neighborhood. You're sure you don't want to sell? You're sure you don't want to sell? Think of the property values, man." I don't think people called each other man back then, but you get the gist. But another area where we can see evidence of discrimination is in voting access, very similar to today. I mentioned earlier how the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and it contained these provisions talking about the states that had a history of voter suppression. The types of voter suppression that were used were very. First of all, the Voting Rights Act was very much a necessary bill. It was not any kind of symbolic gesture designed to placate Black Americans and civil rights protesters. It was very necessary because of this ongoing voter suppression, and the types of tactics that they would use to suppress the minority vote were very, very wide-ranging. One of the more prominent examples of it was something called literacy tests, and the premise behind them it was similar to the premise behind the voter ID laws, in that it wasn't necessarily too objectionable on paper and when taken at face value. The premise was that, to be able to vote, you should be able to read. Which, okay, if you don't dig any deeper than that, if you just stop right there, okay, that doesn't sound that bad. But the thing is that these tests were insane, and they were very intentionally designed to confuse the reader and make it as hard as possible to vote. And they would be like 50 questions long, and if you get a single question wrong, you don't get to vote because you can't read. But one of the most famous examples of these questions was how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? Do you know how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? I mean, probably like at least 10, right? I don't know. But if you don't know the answer to that question, you don't get to vote because you can't read. Apparently. Another way that they disenfranchised minority voters, and really poor voters overall, but particularly poor minority voters, was poll taxes. And this is when you showed up at the polling station, you had to pay a fee to be able to go in and vote, which is very illegal. And should these tactics fail, if someone is able to, if they show up and they can pay the poll tax and they somehow get all the questions right on the literacy test, people were not afraid to just resort to, good old violence and intimidation, tried and true tactics. You might just show up at the voting station and the polling place and see that there's just a growing mob of white people, holding, clubs and rocks to throw at you and red hot irons to prod you with. And they say, and shotguns. And they say, you sure you want to vote? You sure? I don't know about you guys, but if I go anywhere and I am met with a crowd of white people, I turn around and go home. Something about a large group of white people just, I don't know, that doesn't sit well with me. But so these tactics were very effective. In the year 1890, which, yes, I know that 1890 is not in the 20th century, so you don't need to comment that. But I'm sure people will anyway. That's not the 20th century! Ah! But anyway, in the year 1890, in the state of South Carolina alone, there were just under 729,000 Black Americans living in the state of South Carolina. And of those 729,000, only 5,500 were registered to vote. Meaning that 723,500 Black Americans in South Carolina just weren't registered to vote because it just wasn't worth it. There were just too many hoops to jump through. There's these crazy literacy tests, and there's the poll taxes, and there's these mobs of white people ready to go lynch you if you show up at the polling station. It's just not worth it. There's just too many hoops to jump through. It's very similar to today, even though the tactics have changed. But the goal of the modern day voter suppression techniques is just to make it not worth it to vote. You have to go wait in these crazy 6-hour lines where at which point you find out that your polling place has been changed, or that you don't have an ID that's correct, or that you've been purged from the voter list, or and so it's not worth it to vote. Another example of racial discrimination, though, in the 20th century is something called the Southern Strategy. And this was used by Richard Nixon starting in the 1968 election. And it has been used by Republican candidates basically ever since. But the Southern Strategy, the idea behind it was to appeal to disaffected Southern white conservative voters who had become disillusioned by the Democratic Party in recent years. And because actually the South used to be called the Solid South because it so reliably voted Democratic. It was just a given in every single election that the entire Deep South was going to vote Democratic. But that changed in the 1960s when the Democratic Party took a very sharp turn towards socially liberal causes, particularly civil rights. But so the Southern Strategy was a strategy to appeal to the Southern white voters. It's very aptly named, the Southern Strategy. But they would use something, Richard Nixon, he would use something called dog whistle racism. And Republican candidates still use it, but what dog whistle racism is we all know what a dog whistle is. You blow into it, and only the dogs can pick up on it. Like that dog that was barking outside earlier. Apparently, it's not. It's dead. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe someone used a dog whistle. Anyway, but dog whistle racism is the use of fairly seemingly unobjectionable phrases that racists pick up on. One of the most famous examples of dog whistle racism is the use of the phrase law and order, which might sound familiar to you if you've been paying attention to this election cycle. Donald Trump has campaigned on law and order. But Richard Nixon in 1968, he campaigned very heavily on restoring law and order to the country, because for the several years preceding that, there had been countless civil rights demonstrations that had turned to violent because they'd been met with violence. Sound familiar? But there'd been all these violent demonstrations across the country, and for years, and after the death of Martin Luther King in 1968, and as well as the death of Robert Kennedy in 1968, there were massive riots across the country, in Los Angeles and Detroit and Boston, and so Richard Nixon campaigned really heavily on restoring law and order to the country. And the average person, they would, who just, they go home at the end of the day and open up the newspaper, turn on the news and see all these riots and all this violence, and they would think, oh my gosh, yeah, things are just so crazy right now. We do need law and order. But the racists would hear that for what it actually meant, which was put all the black people in jail. Like I said, the Southern Strategy, that came into play during the 1968 election. Another aspect of the 1968 election was the candidacy of a guy named George Wallace. He had been the Democratic governor, so neither party is blameless in all of this, but he had been the Democratic governor of Alabama from 1963 to 1967. And he was very steadfastly, violently opposed to the civil rights movement. And in fact, in a speech in 1963, he said that his goal for America was segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And so when he ran for president in 1968, he ran as a third-party candidate. He ran under the American Independent Party, which was a party that he had created. And the 1968 election was the last election in which a third-party candidate received electoral votes. And the way that the Electoral College works in the United States is that the candidate that receives the most votes in a state gets all of that state's electoral votes. And so he got the most votes in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. 5 southern states, 4 deep south states. And he actually came in second place in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. So he didn't get the electoral votes of those states, but there was a very large Southern following for George segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever Wallace in 1968. And if 1865, if the Civil War is not that long ago, 1968 is not that long ago. That's within both of my parents' lifetimes that there was a large Southern following for an explicitly pro-segregation candidate. And that's a very uncomfortable truth that we have to grapple with. And it starts with talking about it. But so, I've been talking about examples of racism in the 20th century. We can go back even further. We can go look at the 19th century, so the 1800s, and find further examples of racism. One of the most prominent examples is slavery in the Civil War. And I don't have too much time to go into the Civil War itself right now, but the Civil War was about slavery. That's something that we just have to accept. But the thing about the Civil War is that it ended with the forced ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. If the Confederacy, who are traitors, they left the country and fought against the president and the rest of the country to the death, and then lost. In order for the Confederate States to be readmitted back into the Union, they were forced to ratify these three amendments, which, among other things, abolished slavery in most cases, but I'll get to that in a minute. And they gave black men the right to vote, or at least the right to vote on paper. Women didn't get the right to vote until 1919 with the passage of the 19th Amendment, and then black people didn't really get the right to vote until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, because of the literacy tests and the poll taxes and the intimidation and but so these these amendments were forced to be passed, and it's good that they were passed. It's good that slavery was abolished, but the thing is that the wounds of the Civil War, the wounds that the Confederate soldiers faced, and the wounds that the formerly enslaved black Americans faced, were never healed. They were just papered over. But so in the era following the Civil War, it's called the Reconstruction era because they're reconstructing the South and the country. It too was very aptly named. But in the Reconstruction era, 9 states passed what were called vagrancy laws. There's like a moth flying over there. But anyway, 9 states passed what were called vagrancy laws, and these were laws that made it a crime not to have a job, and they could theoretically be applied to any race. They had actually existed for several hundred years before the Civil War, but they were used in the Reconstruction era South to detain recently freed slaves and put them back into the economy as what were called leased convicts. And 8 of these 9 states actually allowed prisoners, most of whom were black men who had been arrested for not having jobs because they had just been freed from slavery. 8 of those 9 states that passed these laws allowed them to be hired out to plantation owners for little to no pay, because the 13th Amendment, which was the one that abolished slavery, it did not abolish slave labor for prisoners. But so they would find themselves back on these plantations that they had just been freed from, they'd just been liberated from, and they were forced to work under just awful working conditions. And slavery was no picnic. Slavery was not good. But a thing about slavery is that a slave was considered property of the slave owner. A slave owner would pay money to own that slave. But so they had a vested interest in the I won't say the well-being of that slave, because that's a little too far, but they had an interest in making sure that their slaves that they paid money for didn't just drop dead in the field, because they paid money for that slave. But they had absolutely no vested interest in the well-being of a leased convict. If a convict dies in your field, in your plantation, you can just go get another. You can probably go get another 5. but so yeah, bad working conditions, and you can go back even further and continue to find these historical examples of racism and discrimination. uh, I mean, even back to like the founding of the country, there's something called the Three-Fifths Compromise, which was that during the constitutional conventions, when the states, I guess colonies at the time, they were deciding how exactly they would set up this country that they're forming. When they were deciding how to allot representation for what would eventually become Congress, for the legislative branch, Southern colonies that had a large slave population said that each of their slaves, if they have one slave, that should count as one person for the sake of representation. And northern states, which had little to no slave population, they said, okay, well, no, that's bullshit. If you're using a person as a slave, you don't get to count them as a person in the census. You just want more seats in Congress. And I guess they didn't call it Congress back then, but you just want more seats in this thing we're building. But so the compromise that they reached it's called the Three-Fifths Compromise, and it stated that black people, that slaves would be 3/5 of a person. One black person is 0.6 people, and 2 black people is 1.2 people. 3 black people is 1.8 people. 4 black people is 2.4 people, and 5 black people is 3 people. And so when we talk about like systemic racism, this is the kind of thing we mean. It's literally built into the system. The country would not have been able to be founded if people weren't willing to be fine with black people counting as 3/5 of a person. But so, like I said, examples of racism exist all around us, and they always have. I mean, perhaps even in this very room. Although perhaps not. I mean, I do have a large poster of Hitler on the wall, but that's actually just covering up a tunnel that I'm digging to the house next door. I saw a bag of animal crackers on their kitchen counter the other day, so I'm just trying to, get my hands on those. The store is like really far away. But think back to the voter ID laws that I talked about at the beginning of this video. With all this historical, context and information in mind, do you really think that it's a coincidence that the same states, the states with a long history of voter suppression and disenfranchisement, the same states that fought to the death to preserve the institution of slavery of black people, the same states that enacted explicit de jure discrimination of every aspect of public life during the 20th century, the same states that voted for George Segregation Now, Tomorrow, and Forever Wallace within both of my parents' lifetimes. Is it really a coincidence that those same states just happened to enact voter ID laws that disproportionately impact minority voters in the immediate aftermath of the Voting Rights Act being partially overturned? Do you really truly believe that that's a coincidence? You might have to tell yourself it's a coincidence in order to not feel a sense of shame about our country, but do you really, honestly, truly believe it? Frankly, I think it's hard to believe. And there's a reason why it's hard to believe. And in all fairness, for white people, for white Americans who have grown up being taught about, American exceptionalism and manifest destiny and things like that, this can all be a very hard pill to swallow. It doesn't fit with the narrative that has been spoon-fed to us from day one. It doesn't make sense how a country that is supposedly so great can have participated in such awful things for so long. I don't understand how there can be regulated bigotry. Some of us don't even wonder. Some of us don't even care. Couldn't we just help each other? Can't we make ourselves aware? There's got to be a way to connect this world today. come together to relieve the pain. Yeah, there's got to be a way to unite this human race, and together we'll bring on a change. Sorry, that's Mariah Carey. It's called "There's Got to Be a Way." It's about how there's got to be a way. It too is very aptly named. There's got to be a way. But she sings it way better than I do. But anyway, with Mariah Carey in mind, the question now becomes what do we do about racism? Thankfully, the solution is actually pretty simple. We just need to ignore it and hope that it goes away. So thanks for watching, everyone. Have a great night. I'm just kidding. Honestly, it's hard to know what to do. It's hard to really even know exactly where to start because the thing is, this isn't just one problem. Racism, keep bumping this, is not just this monolithic thing. It's tens and hundreds and thousands of different problems all gathering under one white hood. And so that means that there isn't just one solution that will fix everything. Personally, I believe that 40, 50 years from now, the election and presidency of Donald Trump will represent the last dying breath of white male supremacy in the United States. It's kind of like when the killer comes back for one last scare at the end of the movie, before Courtney Cox shoots them. Minor scream spoiler, sorry. But so anyway, the only way for Courtney Cox to shoot racism after she seemingly dies in a van crash, if we put in the work that it takes to move past it. Every single one of us as individuals, we have things that we need to do. We need to educate ourselves. We need to educate our friends and our family. We need to have conversations with people, even when they're uncomfortable conversations. Really, especially when they're uncomfortable conversations. That's when they're most important. We need to listen to people of color when they talk. For example, if a Native American person says that it's offensive when we wear, the Native American headdress for Halloween, we as white people don't get to say, no, it's not. That's not our place. We need to listen and think about the space that we take up in conversations. And we as white people need to be okay with admitting when we're wrong. Because it's not fun to be wrong, no matter what you're talking about, even if it's something as simple as types of cheese or something. It's not fun to be wrong. It's embarrassing. It's humbling. But the thing is, the easiest way to get past it is not to just, dig in your heels and say, no, I'm not wrong. You're wrong. No. It's to just own up to it and say that, you didn't realize that XYZ was the case and learn and move on. Say that, yeah, I thought I knew what was up, but I now realize that I was just way off. Was blind, but now I see. When we no, don't worry. But yeah. Don't be afraid to be wrong. Be afraid to stay wrong. And further, everyone, especially white people, but everyone, we all need to admit that we are a little bit racist. Racism is something that exists within all of us because it has so fully permeated every single layer and level and aspect of society that we are all racist. That reminds me of a song from a musical called Avenue Q. It's basically R-rated Sesame Street. The puppets have very loud sex on stage at one point. It's like R-rated Sesame Street. But there's a song in it called Everyone's a Little Bit Racist. It too is very aptly named because it's about how, everyone's a little bit racist. And by the way, while it is great that we are talking about, the struggles and the plights of people of color, if you mean black specifically, say black. because black people, black Americans, have faced a very specific type of injustice. The only reason that Barack Obama and Beyonce and Oprah and oh my gosh, even Ben fucking Carson are in this country today is because just a couple hundred years ago, not that long ago, their ancestors were violently stolen from their homeland and brought here for the express sole purpose of being bought and sold and used and whipped and beaten and raped and murdered and buried as slaves. So if you mean black, say black. But so I'm kind of wrapping up now. I know this was a very long video, so I hope all of you got something out of it. I can actually picture the headlines now. Charming cracker denounces, comma, ends racism, hyphen, has leftovers for dinner. But anyway, if you are still here, if you stuck it through all of this, thank you very much for watching, and have a great night. Not kidding this time.